There is no rewiring without rupture. No success worth the name that does not first descend into the hidden, into what the surface self was constructed to obscure. We speak often of rewiring, as if the mind were a clean circuit board, waiting to be reconfigured by a will, untroubled by contradiction. But the psyche is not circuitry. It is a battlefield, a burial ground, an architecture built atop old ruins, designed not for flourishing but for defense. And success, that elusive prize paraded through the daylight of ambition, it too is often a mask, a compensation, a reaction formation. The ego's attempt to dominate the very forces it was born to appease. We speak of rewiring, yet rarely ask, what are we rewiring against? What has been suppressed to clear the path for forward motion? The unconscious does not forget what the ego cannot tolerate. It stores, it disguises, it reshapes, but it never lets go. And so, before the first step toward this so-called rewiring, one must descend, not climb, into the psychic sediment of one's history, into the spaces where silence reigned because speech would have shattered the fragile bonds of survival, into the traumas not named as trauma, the losses masked as strength, the rage that wore the face of politeness. This is the precondition, not visualization, not affirmation, recognition. We do not become powerful by denying the places where we felt powerless. We become powerful when we dare to name the ghosts that shaped our inner architecture, not to exorcise them, but to see them, to see who we became in their presence, to see the sacrifices made in order to be loved, to see what parts of the self had to fracture so that another part could carry on. You want success? Then begin here, with the truth that your mind was wired not for greatness, but for safety. Safety from pain, from disapproval, from the unbearable truth that love, in its earliest form, was conditional. And so, the psyche split, the body adapted, the inner life grew subterranean, not because you failed, but because you survived. What you call procrastination may be grief. What you call imposter syndrome may be the residue of having once had to be someone else to be accepted. What you call discipline might be the internalized voice of a critical parent. And what you call drive, it might be nothing more than a desperate bid to prove your right to exist. The modern language of success masks the ancient language of repression. And repression, while protective, is costly. For what is repressed does not disappear, it distorts. It leaks into relationships. It erupts in dreams. It wraps itself around your ambitions and whispers quietly, "You are not yet enough." So we strive. We perform. We accumulate, all while dragging behind us the unspoken. The unconscious does not move forward just because the ego wants to succeed. It demands recognition, not bypass, integration, not denial. It demands that we confront the ways we turned against ourselves in order to belong, that we see how our greatest strengths were often born of wound, not will. This is the true rewiring, not a replacement of negative thoughts with positive ones, but the undoing of the compromises we made with ourselves to survive what we could not control. To rewire is to return to the scene of the original conflict, not to change the past, but to witness it consciously, to feel, finally, what had to be numbed, to grieve what was never grieved, to acknowledge the protective lies that became part of our truth. The inner game of life is not won through force. It is endured through recognition, through a radical intimacy with the parts of ourselves we were trained to exile, the dependency we called weakness, the fear we called laziness, the sadness we converted into silence, and beneath all of it, a quiet hunger to be seen, not as we perform, but as we are. That is the unconscious wish behind every conscious pursuit. To succeed is often to beg, in disguise, for the validation that love once withheld. Can you sit with that? Can you bear the possibility that the self you have built in order to triumph may be the very structure that keeps you from truth? We are not blank slates. We are palimpsests of unfinished stories, intergenerational echoes, defensive adaptations layered with longing. Success, if it is to mean anything, must not merely be outward but inward. The success of being able to say, "This is what shaped me, and I no longer need to be ruled by it." But that moment does not arrive through affirmation. It arrives through mourning, through patience, through the slow, meticulous undoing of the psychic knots we once mistook for identity. The inner game is not a game at all. It is a war of recognition, a cold confrontation with the self that developed in the shadows of unmet needs. And to rewire, it is not to ascend, it is to descend deliberately into the abyss and to return with what was left behind. This, and only this, is transformation. This is success, stripped of illusion. This is the ultimate inner game, and it begins where your defenses would rather you never look. There is a reason the mind resists stillness. In stillness, the defense is thin. The silence grows louder. And beneath that silence lies something older than the words we use to narrate ourselves, a pulse of pain that predates our stories, a current of shame wrapped around the roots of our becoming. We were not born fragmented. We became so through repetition, through expectation, through the quiet wounds no one acknowledged because they did not leave a bruise, only a belief that to be fully known was to risk rejection, that to feel fully was to drown. And so we split. We adapted, we coped, we silenced the unbearable, and then forgot we had silenced it. This forgetting, this psychic anesthesia became our normal. But the unconscious remembers. It encodes every compromise, every swallowed cry, every masked need. And it speaks not in words, but in symptoms, in insomnia that does not yield to logic, in anxieties that circle like vultures around our confidence, in sudden bursts of rage, in intimacy that repels, in motivation that dies the moment it is called upon. These are not failures. They are messages, manifestations of what could not be spoken. And we dare call them weakness when they are in fact a form of remembering. The psyche, denied language, speaks in repetition. It reenacts, not because it enjoys the suffering, but because it seeks resolution, understanding, completion. To rewire your mind for success is to understand that success, in the psychological sense, is not the acquisition of power, it is the restoration of wholeness. And wholeness cannot be attained while parts of the self remain exiled. The inner child that learned to hide, the adolescent who had to numb, the adult who lives in performance. Each carries a truth, and truth is not always beautiful. It is often disruptive, terrifying, but also liberating. For the lie we live is heavier than the truth we fear. It costs us presence. It costs us joy. And more than anything, it costs us the right to be authentic, to move not from reaction, but from integration. Ask yourself, who am I when I am not achieving? Who am I when I failed to meet the standards I inherited? Who am I when I stop performing strength? If the answer is silence, then it is not rewiring you need, it is re-encounter. You must meet the selves you abandoned to become who you were expected to be. You must grieve the losses no one gave you permission to grieve. You must stop striving long enough to feel the ache that striving was built to suppress. Only then can you begin. Only then can the nervous system stop bracing. Only then can desire be disentangled from fear. The unconscious does not move on. It circles, it loops, it obsesses until we listen, until we stop mistaking pain for failure and start seeing it as signal. The discomfort you call sabotage may be the very place where the true self waits in chains, but not dead. And to free it is not to destroy the self you've known, but to expand it, to allow contradiction, to live with the dissonance of having needed what you never received, to no longer dress up emptiness with ambition. You do not need to become someone else. You need to recover who you were before the world taught you to perform a version of success that left your inner life starving. And this is not romantic. It is brutal. To see clearly is to strip the ego of its costumes, to stand before the inner tribunal of your own history and admit, I did what I had to do. I coped the only way I knew how, and now I am ready to see how I turned rejection into drive, how I buried need beneath independence, how I wore competence like armor, and how, in doing so, I forgot that strength without vulnerability is not power, it is paralysis. So many speak of mindset, few speak of mourning, but mourning is the true reset, the mourning of who you could not be, the mourning of love that was absent or conditional or distorted, the mourning of parts of yourself you abandoned because they were inconvenient to those you depended on. And through this mourning, something shifts. Slowly, invisibly, the compulsion to repeat begins to loosen. The tyrant within the harsh superego built in the image of early authority begins to soften. Not because it was defeated, but because it was seen. And what is seen loses its power to haunt. This is not healing. Healing implies a return to some pristine state. There is no such state. There is only movement from fragmentation toward coherence, from exile toward presence, from survival toward agency. To rewire is not to replace pain with positivity. It is to place pain within a frame that makes meaning possible. Not every symptom must be eradicated. Some must be translated, understood as expressions of a psychic reality that never had words. That is the task of the inner game, to learn the language of the symptom, to read anxiety as a map, to feel resistance not as obstruction, but as protection. Protection that once served you and now demands your gratitude, not your eradication. You are not broken, you are defended, and those defenses are brilliant, elegant, tragic, human, but they are not permanent. They were built in time. They can be met in time. And as they are met, something loosens. A new kind of success becomes possible. One that does not depend on suppression. One that includes the very parts you were told to hide. This is the deeper project, not to win, but to return, to make contact with the roots, and in doing so, to discover that what you feared most was not failure, but feeling, and what you needed most was not victory, but validation, not from the world, but from yourself, from the self you left behind, waiting, always waiting, beneath the mask. There is a moment in every inward journey when the floor gives out, when the structures we believed were permanent, our confidence, our ambition, our identity begin to dissolve under the weight of what they were built to contain. This collapse is not a crisis. It is contact with the substratum of the psyche, with the primal forces that shaped us long before we had language to describe them. It is in this collapse that we meet ourselves, not as we wish to be, but as we are, conflicted, afraid, desirous, ashamed. And yet, strangely whole. The ego recoils from this. It calls it regression. It calls it weakness. But the truth is far less flattering. The ego was never meant to hold the full complexity of the self. It was meant to manage it, to defend against it, to curate a version of identity that could function in a world that rarely rewards interior truth. But now, you are here. The surface has cracked. The curated self no longer suffices. And the deeper self, the unspoken self, begins to rise. Do not resist it. Resistance is the original trauma replaying itself. The child who learned that feeling too much, needing too much, being too much, meant abandonment. That child still lives in the walls of your ambition, in the hunger beneath your control. And he or she does not need success. He or she needs presence, witness, recognition without agenda. This is the paradox. To become powerful, we must first re-enter powerlessness. Not to dwell there, but to retrieve the parts of us that never left. To re-inhabit the moments where our authenticity was punished, where our boundaries were not formed but invaded, where the only safe thing was to perform. And so we did. We learned to please, to excel, to predict and adapt. And in doing so, we survived, but we also disappeared. Rewiring begins the moment we decide to be visible again, not to the world but to ourselves, to bring light to the mechanisms we once ran on unconsciously. The scripts inherited from parents, from culture, from fear, the voice that says, if I stop, I will fall apart. If I feel this, I will not come back. If I rest, I will be forgotten. These are not irrational fears. They were once true, but they are no longer true. And until we examine them, we live as if they still are. You cannot wire a new future while dragging the unlived past behind you. You cannot build freedom on foundations poured in fear. The nervous system does not lie. It holds every moment you were not allowed to be whole. And it does not respond to motivational slogans. It responds to safety, to attunement, to the slow, careful work of saying, I see you. You don't have to disappear anymore. You get to exist, even when you are not performing. Success that costs the self is not success. It is self-betrayal wrapped in applause. It is emptiness disguised as victory. And yet, this is the only success many of us were trained to pursue. Not because we were flawed, but because we were taught that being lovable required being exceptional, that our worth was conditional on our usefulness, that our value depended on staying in control. But the self does not thrive in control. It thrives in connection. And connection begins not with others, but within. The internal connection between your pain and your purpose, between your fear and your creativity, between your shame and your sensitivity. These are not obstacles. They are origins. And when seen, truly seen, they become power. This is why the unconscious resists rewiring, because to change is to confront the losses we built our lives around avoiding, to name the betrayals that shaped our beliefs, to feel the despair that once had no witness. And yet, it is only through this confrontation that freedom begins. Not a sudden euphoric freedom, a quiet one, the kind that comes not from escaping your story, but from re-entering it with eyes open. This is the work, to walk back into the fire of your own history and retrieve what still burns, to feel what you once froze, to say to the child within, I will not leave you behind just to look successful. And in doing so, to reclaim your right to a life that is not performance, but presence. You do not need to fix yourself. You need to stop abandoning yourself. Again and again, every time the old fears arise, every time the old voices return. They will return. This is not failure. It is repetition. And repetition is how the psyche processes what was once unprocessable. Do not rush it. Do not try to erase it. Listen. Learn its language. Honor its rhythm. That is rewiring. Not replacement, but recognition. Because beneath the resistance is always longing. Longing to be known, not managed. To be embraced, not optimized. To be allowed. And when that longing is no longer exiled, when it is welcomed into awareness without shame, the system reorganizes. Slowly, naturally. The war within begins to quiet. And in its place, a new voice emerges. A voice not of striving, but of truth. You are not here to become perfect. You are here to become whole. And wholeness is not a product of doing. It is a product of turning toward what you were taught to turn away from. Of saying yes to the feelings that once meant danger. Of being with yourself in the ways others could not be with you. This is success in its truest form. Not the external image, but the internal alignment. Not the mask, but the face beneath it. Not the applause, but the peace of knowing you no longer need it to feel real. This is how you rewire the mind, not by controlling it, but by listening to it. Not by silencing your symptoms, but by following them like breadcrumbs to the places in you that still wait to be held. And in holding them, gently, persistently, honestly, you begin to remember who you were before the world told you who to be. And who you were before the world intervened is not gone, only buried. Buried beneath layers of adaptation, under the thick armor of compliance, perfectionism, cynicism, or numbness. You have not lost yourself. You have learned to survive without full access to yourself. And survival, though necessary, is not the same as living. It protects, but it also obscures. It keeps us moving, but it does not let us rest, because rest requires safety. And how can you rest when a part of you still believes that to stop performing is to disappear? That belief lives deep. It is not intellectual. It is cellular. It is the nervous system flinching at the memory of disapproval, of abandonment, of punishment. It is the learned association between visibility and shame, between vulnerability and harm. And so we hide. We hide behind achievements. We hide behind knowledge. We hide behind competence. But the hiding never ends, because the child who learned to hide has no sense of when it is finally safe to be seen. Rewiring means giving that child a different ending. It means rewriting the association between authenticity and danger, between softness and humiliation. It means creating an inner environment in which all parts of you are permitted to speak, to grieve, to rage, to want. And not only permitted, but welcomed, because what you suppress does not die. It governs you from the shadows. It turns goals into compulsions, relationships into reenactments, desire into guilt. And so the work is not to overpower the unconscious, but to befriend it, to develop a relationship with the internal world as intricate, as intimate, as devoted as any relationship you have externally. Because until that relationship is repaired, success will remain hollow. You will achieve and feel nothing. You will arrive and want to leave. You will win and feel only relief that you have temporarily escaped the truth you refuse to confront. But truth is patient. It waits in the body, in the symptoms, in the dreams. It waits until you are tired enough, or brave enough, or broken enough to finally listen. And when you do, what you find is not destruction but clarity. Painful, yes, but clarifying, because what hurts more than anything is not the truth. It is the loneliness of never having had the truth acknowledged. The inner game begins when you stop trying to upgrade your programming and start trying to understand it. When you stop asking, "How do I fix this?" and start asking, "Why did this form in the first place?" Because every block, every fear, every compulsion once served a purpose, once kept you safe, and even now they are trying to protect you. The anxiety that prevents you from speaking up, the perfectionism that keeps you up at night, the procrastination that delays your progress. None of these are flaws. They are messengers, sentinels of an earlier logic, the logic of adaptation. You will not override them with willpower. You must meet them with reverence, curiosity, compassion. You must become fluent in the dialect of your own defenses. You must learn to say, "I see why you're here. I know what you're trying to do for me." And only then can you say, "I no longer need you to work so hard." This is not fast work. It is not linear. The psyche does not follow timelines. It follows trust, and trust is earned slowly through presence, through repetition, through not abandoning yourself in the places you were once abandoned. That is how rewiring occurs, through the creation of new associations, through showing the nervous system over and over that it is finally safe to feel what once could not be felt. And this safety is not given to you by the world. It is built within. It is not dependent on outcomes. It is not conditional on success. It is a way of relating to yourself that does not fluctuate with performance. A way of saying, even here, in this failure, in this regression, in this shame, I will not leave you. Most people never reach this place, not because they cannot, but because they are too loyal to the identities they built to survive, too invested in appearing strong to ever admit they feel weak, too entangled in the illusion of control to ever surrender to the chaos of truth. But you are beginning to see that the real work has nothing to do with productivity and everything to do with presence, that the greatest success is not found in the eyes of others, but in the quiet relief of no longer betraying yourself. So go deeper, not wider. Go down into the layers, into the shame that shaped your striving, into the guilt that shaped your caretaking, into the terror that shaped your independence. These are not errors. They are maps. And when you follow them, when you stop resisting and start relating, you begin to feel something you forgot was possible. Peace. Not the peace of perfection, but the peace of honesty. You will still feel fear, still feel resistance, but you will no longer be ruled by them. You will begin to act from alignment, not avoidance, from inner authority, not external approval. And slowly, your definition of success will change. It will become less about domination and more about integration, less about arrival and more about embodiment. And that is where power lives, not in the performance, but in the permission, not in the mask, but in the face behind it, not in what you show the world, but in what you are no longer afraid to see within yourself. That is rewiring. That is the inner game. That is the beginning of everything real. Everything real begins where illusion ends, where the carefully arranged facades collapse under the weight of your own exhaustion, where the smile no longer fits, the plan no longer motivates, and the goal, once burning bright, begins to feel strangely hollow. This is not failure. This is the psychic moment of reckoning. The moment when the soul, tired of being managed, begins to make itself known again, not with fury, but with ache, not with ambition, but with honesty. And honesty is never convenient. It ruins what comfort relies on denial. It disrupts what repression keeps organized. It asks, what have you been running from in your pursuit of becoming? And deeper still, who is the one running, and why was it never safe to stop? These are not intellectual questions. They are psychic ruptures. If you answer them honestly, something old in you dies not in punishment, but in release. Because you were never meant to carry this much. The pressure, the perfection, the persistent self-monitoring. You inherited a system, psychological, cultural, familial, that taught you to regulate yourself not for your truth, but for others' comfort. You became a manager of perceptions, an editor of feelings, a strategist of belonging. And while that adaptation kept you in connection, it severed you from yourself. Now, the cost is surfacing. In burnout, in chronic dissatisfaction, in relationships that mimic the very patterns you swore to outgrow. This, too, is not failure. This is material, rich, fertile material for rewiring, not because it is easy, but because it is true, and truth is the only condition under which integration can occur. To rewire the mind for success, you must first redefine success. Strip it of the projections you inherited. Remove from it the voice of your father's disappointment, your mother's anxiety, the culture's worship of productivity. Ask not, what should I do with my life? But what within me is asking to be felt before I do anything more. That is where your path begins, in sensation, in memory, in affect, in the subtle tremors of a nervous system, remembering that it, too, is worthy of gentleness. Rewiring is not a mindset hack. It is a reparenting of the psyche, a reorientation from exile to inclusion, a long, slow return to the body where every unprocessed experience still waits. That sadness you distracted yourself from, still there. That fear you shamed yourself for, still there. That anger you intellectualized into nothing, still there. And every one of them is a fragment of your wholeness, waiting, knocking, asking not to be solved, but to be felt. This is the cost of avoidance fragmentation. And this is the promise of contact coherence. When you stop running from your own feelings, they stop needing to control you. When you allow the grief to pass through you, it no longer sabotages your future. When you make space for the part of you that feels small, that part stops hijacking your voice. This is not abstract. This is neurological. The brain reshapes itself, not through suppression, but through safety, through presence, through repetition, through truth. And the truth is, you are not behind. You are not broken. You are not late. You are exactly where the psyche brings you when it can no longer tolerate the cost of being unseen. You are in the middle of the story, not the end. And the middle is messy, chaotic, disorienting. But it is also sacred, because it is here that the real work begins. The work not of becoming someone else, but of coming home to who you were before shame taught you to perform. So let the process unfold. Let the old ambitions crumble if they were built on fear. Let the strategies collapse if they were rooted in scarcity. Let the urgency soften. Let the noise fade. Let your breath deepen and listen. Listen to what remains when the performance ends. Listen to the quiet voice beneath the fear. The voice that says, I am tired of hiding. I am tired of proving. I am ready to feel, to know, to become. This is not motivation. This is mourning. And mourning is what rewiring truly demands. Mourning the years spent running. Mourning the innocence lost to adaptation. mourning the parts of you that died to keep the rest alive. And through mourning, a new spaciousness opens, not filled with answers, but with possibility. A possibility not driven by fear, but by alignment. A success not built on erasure, but on integration. You do not need to be more. You need to be with what hurts, with what hungers, with what hopes, with what never had words. And in this withness, you begin to rewire not for performance but for presence, not for applause but for authenticity, not for dominance but for deep embodied self-trust. You were never meant to conquer yourself. You were meant to understand yourself, and in that understanding, to find a way of living that no longer requires escape, that no longer splits your psyche into parts that hustle and parts that hide, that no longer sacrifices your inner truth for external gain. Rewiring begins here, in the soft, slow willingness to feel what was once unfelt, in the radical act of becoming real, not later, not when you're better, not when you've achieved more, but now, as you are, in your need, in your depth, in your humanity. That is the ultimate inner game, and it is won not by defeating the self, but by returning to it, again and again, until the self no longer hides when you enter the room. And so we arrive not at a destination, but at a threshold. You came seeking rewiring, a path to success, a map out of the maze. But now you see, the maze was not outside you. It was within, constructed from memories unspoken, loyalties unexamined, griefs ungrieved. Every ambition, every sabotage, every high and low, it all pointed inward, toward the place where the psyche still waits to be seen without condition. This is the end, yes, but not of the journey. It is the end of pretending, the end of the war against your own depth, the end of chasing a life polished enough to distract from pain unprocessed. Now begins something quieter, more honest, more costly perhaps, but infinitely more real. A life that includes all of you, a success that doesn't ask you to amputate your past to step into your future. A strength born not from denial, but from integration. Do not rush from here. Let the silence after these words speak louder than the noise of the world. Let what stirs in you now, that ache, that recognition, that gentle trembling be honored, because something in you is waking, something ancient, something buried, and it does not need to be fixed. It needs to be followed. There is no final triumph. There is only the next honest step. Take it,